The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar, the IFLA LRM Model, A Brief Introduction. I'm Lisa Lorenzo, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Tom Dousa. Tom is the Metadata Analyst Librarian at the University of Chicago Library. He holds an MLS from Indiana University Bloomington and a PhD in Library and Information Science from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, with a specialization in the history and theory of knowledge organization. He is interested in emerging conceptual models used in cataloging. He brings much expertise to today's topic, and we are fortunate to have him with us today. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for our presenter, please enter those in the questions box on your screen. We will have time for Q&A after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now, here is Tom. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning to those still on the West Coast. My name is Tom, and thank you to Lisa for her kind introduction. My name is Tom Dousa. I'm the metadata analyst at the University of Chicago Library, where I work with both traditional MARC and non-MARC metadata. I'm also currently serving as co-vice chair of the ALCTS Bibliographical Conceptual Models Interest Group, formerly known as the FRBR Interest Group. And so this talk falls naturally into my field of interest. So I speak about IFLA LRM. As you know, the conceptual model known as FRBR, Functional Requirements for Bibliographical Records, provides the underlying intellectual scaffolding for RDA, which is the currently prevailing cataloging code in the Anglophone cataloging world. One obvious manifestation of this is that the text of this code in the RDA Toolkit is currently structured in accordance with the conceptual structure of FRBR. Now, in 2017, a new conceptual model was released under the aegis of IFLA as a successor to FRBR. This is known as the IFLA Library Reference Model, IFLA LRM, which I shall refer to simply as LRM. Now, the RDA 3R project, that is to say the RDA Toolkit Restructure and Redesign project, is currently preparing a revised version of RDA that will reshape the structure of the code in accordance with LRM, with the final stabilization of the text anticipated to be complete in April 2019. Since LRM will form the conceptual basis of the restructured RDA Toolkit, catalogers and the metadata librarians need to familiarize themselves with it. Now, LRM represents a development from FRBR and its related models, and so many of its features will be recognizable to those who are well acquainted with FRBR. However, it also differs in some significant ways from the FRBR model. And in other words, we are dealing with both continuity and change. So my purpose here is to offer an overview of some of the basic features of the new LRM model, to show how they emerged from FRBR and associated models, and to draw your attention to key points where LRM departs from the FRBR model, since the latter are most likely to be stumbling blocks for those making the conceptual transition from FRBR to LRM. I hope then that this presentation may hope to smooth our path as we begin to refund our thinking from FRBR to LRM. So here then is the agenda. As I noted a moment ago, LRM draws most of its content from FRBR and two other functional requirements models. A quick review of these models will prove useful for understanding many of the elements of LRM, and so I'll begin with them as background. Next, we will turn to the LRM User Tasks, and then go to the heart of the model, which is the entities and the attributes of and the relationships therein. For this talk, I will look at LRM entities, looking first at the key bibliographical entities of works, expressions, manifestations, and items, which have been retained in LRM from FRBR, but slightly redefined. I'll take a look at the definition of the person entity, which has undergone some change. And then I'll take a look at one of the new entities that is of a special importance in LRM, namely the Nomen. Then I'll take a quick look at attributes, looking at particular at three attributes that again depart markedly from FRBR: the representative expression, the manifestation statement, and the Nomen string. Finally, if we have time, I'll look at relationships, but it's possible that we may have to skip over those today. I should note that I will not be covering one innovation in LRM, the modeling of aggregate works and its implications for serials. The reason for this is that our time is limited, and this is a very complex topic that does not lend itself to easy explication in a few minutes. Indeed, it could easily be a topic for a whole other webinar, and probably should be. So let us now turn LRM and its background. So LRM stands for Library Reference Model, and this of course raises the question, well, what precisely is a reference model? According to a definition promulgated by OASIS, the Organization for the Advancement of Structured Information Standards, a reference model is an abstract framework for understanding significant relationships among the entities of some environment and for the development of consistent standards or specifications supporting that environment. A reference model is based on a small number of unifying concepts. It is not directly tied to any standards, technologies, or other concrete implementation details, but it does seek to provide a common semantics that can be used unambiguously across and between different implementations. So keeping this definition in mind, we can say that LRM is a reference model for a specific environment, that is to say, the library, and more specifically, library bibliographic systems, and is intended to provide a basis for the formulation of cataloging rules and the development of such bibliographic information systems. Note that a reference model is not tied to any specific program of implementation, but can be implemented in different ways in different contexts. This means that the RDA implementation of LRM will be only one of many possible implementations of the system. At the same time, the fact that LRM provides a common semantics, and by common semantics we can understand commonly shared definitions for entities and the relationships among them across different implementations, means that it will allow for interoperability between such implementations, even if they diverge in points of detail, such as, for example, in their choice of content or data models. This, of course, follows the ethos of linked data and the semantic web, where a common framework may serve as a forum within which different bibliographic and other information systems can be shared across the boundaries of those particular systems. So now, IFLA LRM is a harmonization of three different models for functional requirements, and these three models, in fact, were already reference models in their own right. The first of these, which I've already mentioned several times, is FRBR, an acronym for the Functional Requirements for bibliographical data. The second of these is FRAD, or functional requirements for authority data. And the third is FRSAD, or functional requirements for subject authority data. All of these are conceptual models constructed according to entity relationship modeling techniques, and so all share the same formalism. In terms of content, there is significant overlap between these three models with regards to the entities treated, but there are significant differences as well. For example, FRBR treats names as attributes, whereas FRAD and FRSAD treat them as entities. Interestingly, we shall see further that the scope of the notion of name as an entity differs between FRAD and FRSAD. Another example is that FRBR and FRAD define person in different ways, as we shall see later on. Thus, the goal of the group that put together LRM was to take these three models, to smooth out the differences between them, and to remove those elements from the models that would no longer be necessary, so as to create a single, unified, and streamlined model. So let's take a look at some of the models at the basis of LRM. The first of these, which many of you will know intimately, is FRBR. FRBR consists essentially of three groups of entities. Group 1 consists of bibliographical entities that are described in bibliographic records, namely works, expressions, manifestations, and items, often known as WEMI for short. In principle, any information resource for which a catalog record is made can be resolved into these four entities, and it is assumed that the users of catalogs are in search of information about one or the other of these entities. Group 2 entities, on the other hand, are those entities involved in the creation, in different senses of the term, modification, or ownership of the Group 1 entities. Group 3 entities, on the other hand, are other entities, namely concepts, objects, events, and places, that, together with Group 1 and Group 2 entities, can serve as subjects of works. Such then is FRBR. When we turn to FRAD, we see that the FRAD model presupposes all the entities of the FRBR model, but extends it by introducing new entities and relationships. These new entities are names and identifiers of bibliographic entities, by which bibliographic entities are known, and the controlled access points that are the standardized forms of names that are enshrined in our authority files. And if we look at a fuller form of the FRAD model, this gives a better sense of how it relates to the FRBR entities, all of which are encapsulated within the top box for bibliographic entities. Important to note here is that names, identifiers, and controlled access points each partake in different relationships within the FRAD model. Names are appellations of bibliographic entities, while identifiers are assigned to bibliographic entities, and controlled access points, on the other hand, are only indirectly related to the bibliographic entities since they are based on the names or identifiers of those entities. So what's important here is that names, identifiers, and controlled access points are the same kinds of entities, and yet they maintain a distinction among themselves. A name is not precisely the same thing as an identifier, although they are closely related. When we turn to the FRSAD model, finally, it deals with the naming of subjects. within the bibliographic universe. And as such, it has a fairly simple model. A work has as a subject what's known as thema, and thema is a Greek term that serves as the FRSAD entity for subject. So one can simply read subject for thema. And each thema, on the other hand, has an appellation or a name, which is known as nomen, again, the Latin term for name. Note that the nomen entity in FRSAD is broader than FRAD's name, since it encompasses the concepts of name, identifier, and controlled access point under itself. In other words, whereas William Shakespeare would be a name in FRAD, and whereas Shakespeare, William, 1564-1616 would be a controlled access point, in FRSAD, both of them would be viewed as different instantiations of a single nomen. When we look at FRSAD in relation to FRBR, then we see that essentially all of the FRBR entities, group 1, group 2, and group 3, can be treated as themas or subjects, and each of them can be instances of the thema entity, and each of them then is related in some way to a nomen. So those, in any case, were the three conceptual models that lie at the basis of LRM, and of which LRM can be viewed as a derivation. When we now let's take a look at LRM user tasks. User tasks now serve as functional requirements of bibliographical systems in LRM. This means that the entities, attributes, and relationships of the model should promote the successful performance of the user tasks that it stipulates. To put this in other words, the user tasks are the ends of any bibliographic system that is a model that takes LRM as its basis. And the entities, attributes, and relations defined in LRM are the means by which a bibliographic system seeks to facilitate these ends. Now, user tasks, of course, imply users, and the intended users of LRM are both the end users and intermediaries working on behalf of them to meet their information needs, as well as library staff and others who are responsible for the creation and the maintenance of the bibliographic data that are used to meet these informational needs, who often use the same data as end users to carry out their tasks. And LRM thus defines 5 different user tasks. The tasks are to find, identify, select, obtain, and explore. The first 4 of these will be familiar to most of you from FRBR and are known collectively as FISO, while the 5th is a new user task. It's based primarily on a user task defined in FRSAD. In its original FRSAD context, the explore task was directed primarily to navigating the relationship between different subjects. In LRM, it has been generalized for the navigation of relationships between information resources. One result of its inclusion is that it mandates a greater emphasis on entities and the relationships between them, while de-emphasizing attributes, which are simply characteristics of particular entities. This again is consonant with a linked data environment where one wants to create graphs that relate entities to one another and that can then be navigated and explored. Those then were the user tasks. Now let's turn to the entities and the attributes that are supposed to facilitate the performance of those tasks. LRM defines 11 entities in all. Of these, the topmost one in the slide, res, the Latin term for thing, is derived from FRSAD's theme or subject entity and refers to any entity in the universe of discourse. And another way of looking at this is to think of it as any entity about which somebody may think something and try to communicate something about it. The next four entities, work, manifestation, expression, and item, are all derived from FRBR's group 1, whereas the next three entities, agent, person, and collective agent, are in essence a reformulation of FRBR's group 2. Nomen, as we have seen, derives from FRSAD and FRAD. Place, the entity of place, derives from one of the group 3 entities in FRBR, whereas time span is an entirely new as an entity. In fact, the only entirely new entity in LRM. In FRBR, FRSAD, and FRAD, the time span was treated as an attribute. Here it has been elevated to the rank of an entity. Now, in contradistinction to the earlier models, the entities in LRM are structured according to an is-a hierarchy. Now, an is-a hierarchy is something logically akin to a genus, species, or generic hierarchy, and here it consists of 3 levels. The res is the single entity to appear at the first top level of the hierarchy. This means that every entity occurring within LRM can be viewed as an instance of res. 8 of the entities, which are the members of the WEMI stack, work, manifestation, expression, and item, as well as agent, nomen, place, and time span, occur at the second level of the hierarchy, while only 2 entities, both subclasses of the agent entity, occur at the third level. Now, the is-a relationships obtaining between a class and its subclass in this hierarchical scheme is such that the subclass inherits the attributes of its superordinate class. Thus, for example, the person and collective agent entities inherit all the attributes of the agent subclass, which in turn inherits all the attributes of its superordinate class, which is res. Important to note here is that the entities at each level of the hierarchy are disjoint. That is to say, they form entirely mutually exclusive categories. This means, for example, that if a given entity is defined as a person, that means it cannot be a collective agent. It can be either a person or a collective agent or not, and so on. By the same token, this means that a work cannot be a manifestation, an expression, an item, or any other of the entities that occurs at the same level. So then that was the inventory and the hierarchical articulation of the LRM entities. Let's take a closer look at some of the core entities in this model. As in FRBR, the 4 bibliographical entities, work, expression, manifestation, and item, form an abstraction hierarchy, the most abstract entity being the work, and the most concrete being the item. These stand in a certain well-defined relationships to one another that all of you will know. A work is realized through an expression is embodied in a manifestation, a manifestation is exemplified by an item. In LRM, these relationships remain exactly the same, even if the visual representation now depicts the relationships as diagonal lines instead of rectilinear lines bent at 90-degree angles. However, when we look at the definitions, we see that there are some interesting changes. First of all, when we look at the work, we see that in FRBR, a work was defined as a distinct intellectual or artistic creation. In LRM, however, it is defined as the intellectual or artistic content of a distinct creation. Note that whereas the FRBR definition defined the work as a creation, LRM characterizes it as the content of a creation. This new definition, I think, is an improvement on the old, since it no longer simply identifies the work as the end product of a process, but singles it out as the content of the product of the process. This specifies more precisely what a work is. Furthermore, it allows one to extend the meaning of creation to encompass more than simply intellectual artistic content. One point to note here is that according to the scope note for work in LRM, a work comes into existence simultaneously with the creation of its first expression. No work can exist without there being at least one expression of the work. This is an important stipulation, since this relation of dependence was not clearly spelled out in FRBR, and so left open the intriguing possibility that works might exist independently of any expression. LRM forecloses this possibility of having works floating out there without expressions by stipulating that every and any work is dependent upon the prior existence of an expression. What then is an expression? In FRBR, an expression was defined as the intellectual or artistic realization of a work in the form of alphanumeric musical or choreographic notation, sound, image, object, movement, etc., or in a combination of such forms. LRM simplifies and generalizes this definition by defining an expression as a distinct combination of signs conveying intellectual or artistic content. Note that here again that whereas the FRBR definition defined the manifestation as an intellectual or artistic realization of a work, LRM simply defines it as a combination of signs with the intellectual and artistic content. Again, the latter definition is clearer in that it removes reference to a process, that of realization, and focuses solely on the nature of the expression, namely that it is a combination of signs that expresses some form of intellectual or artistic content. And note again that an expression comes into existence simultaneously with the creation of its first manifestation. This means again that no work can exist without there being at least one expression of the work. Thus, in the same way that a work is dependent upon an expression, so indeed is an expression dependent upon the manifestation through which it is embodied. And this brings us to manifestations in LRM. A manifestation is the physical embodiment, according to FRBR, is the physical embodiment of an expression of a work. Whereas in LRM, it is a set of all carriers that are assumed to share the same characteristics as to an intellectual or artistic content and aspects of physical form. That set is defined by both the overall content and the production plan for its carrier or carriers. The new LRM definition of the manifestation is a much clearer definition that avoids the ambiguity of its predecessor and neatly encapsulates the interplay between abstract and physical elements involved in the constitution of a manifestation. Whereas according to FRBR, it was unclear whether a manifestation itself is a physical thing or is an abstract entity that relates to physical properties of a given entity. LRM leaves us in no doubt that it is the latter, that a manifestation is an abstract entity that relates to the physical form that is held in common by the set of all physical carriers that share the same characteristics as to intellectual or artistic content. In all fairness, it should be noted that the notion of manifestation as a set of items sharing the same characteristics in physical form already occurred in the fine print of the FRBR and FRSAD documentation. What LRM has done is to make it the chief element of the definition. And finally, we come to the item in LRM. According to the definition in FRBR, an item is a single exemplar of a manifestation, that is to say, a concrete entity or a physical object. In LRM, on the other hand, an item is an object or objects carrying signs intended to convey intellectual or artistic content. The FRBR definition defined items purely in terms of their relation to manifestations. The LRM definition, on the other hand, relates them to expressions and works as well. They are, after all, signs intended to convey the objects that carry signs, that is to say, expressions intended to convey intellectual or artistic content, that is to say, works. Though the specification in the scope note clearly shows that this relationship to expressions and works occurs through the manifestation. Thus, from this very brief conspectus of the four WEMI entities, we see that although LRM assumes the same sort of relationships among the members of the WEMI stack as FRBR, that is to say, realization, embodiment, and exemplification, it no longer defines the WEMI entities primarily in terms of those relationships, but rather it defines them by their essential characteristics as entities in themselves. And so this is quite a good conceptual change, I think, within LRM. So now let's turn to a couple of other core entities within LRM, those of the person and the nomen. Now, the definition of person in FRBR was that of an individual, deceased as well as living, a definition that implied, though it did not explicitly specify, that this individual was a human being. This notion was then expanded in FRAD, which allowed a person to refer not only to individual beings, but to personae or identities assumed by individuals or groups. It also allowed all sorts of fictive characters and even animals treated as performers of literary figures or actors. So, for example, if Benji the dog, if a book was published that claimed that Benji the dog was the author, then Benji the dog would be treated as a person within the framework of FRAD. LRM, on the other hand, adopts a more austere definition, returning to that of FRBR, explicitly stipulating that a person is an individual human being, thus removing animals and fiction from the category. Furthermore, it removes all fictive personae from the purview of the person entity. Rather, these personae are then treated as names or nomens rather than, or clusters of nomens, rather than as persons in themselves. And this brings us then to the nomen in LRM. And this is perhaps the most difficult entity to wrap one's head around in LRM. As defined, it is an association between an entity and the designation that refers to it. The LRM documentation specifies that an arbitrary combination of signs or symbols cannot be regarded as an appellation or designation until it is associated with something in some context. In that sense, the Nomen entity can be understood as the reification of a relationship between an instance of res and the string of characters used to name it. The string of characters composing a name, on the other hand, is a Nomen string and is an attribute of the Nomen. The string itself acquires its meaning as a name only in virtue of its association to a particular res, i.e. a thing, through the act of naming. So let's take an example. For example, the string of letters P-O-C-A-H-O-N-T-A-S, pronounced as Pocahontas, can in one context of naming refer to the 17th century Native American woman who saved the life of Captain John Smith at Jamestown, while in a different context of naming, it can refer to a late 20th century Walt Disney animated motion picture of the same name. In the first case, the Nomen string Pocahontas, P-O-C-A-H-O-N-T-A-S, is associated with the historical personage, and in virtue of this association functions in LRM terms as the nomen of this person, while in the latter case, the Nomen string is used as the title of that work. Needless to say, the nomen of the person is not identical to the nomen of the work, even though both use the same Nomen string. Finally, we should note that any entity referred to in the bibliographic universe of discourse is named through a nomen. In other words, every res has a nomen and no res will be without a nomen. This makes perfect sense if we recall that a res is defined as an entity in a universe of discourse. One cannot write or speak about something if one cannot name it. Let's turn now to and take a quick look at attributes in LRM. Attributes serve to characterize individual instances of entities. That is to say, they represent important characteristics or aspects of those entities. Each entity type, except for collective agent, has its own set of attributes. Especially rich in them are expressions, manifestations, and names. Attributes of superordinate entity classes in the ISA hierarchy of LRM entities are inherited by subordinate classes. Thus, for example, attributes of the top-level category res are inheritable by other classes, while attributes of the agent category are inheritable by its person and collective agent subclasses. Furthermore, attributes listed in LRM, of which there are 37 in OR, are representative, not exhaustive. Additions can be made within individual implementations of LRM depending upon how granular one wants to be in the attributes that one chooses to record. Here we shall limit ourselves to three important attributes: the representative expression, the manifestation statement, and the Nomen string. Let's begin with the representation expression, which is entirely new to LRM. A representation expression is an attribute which is deemed essential in characterizing the work and whose values are taken from a representative or canonical expression of the work. The motivation for the category is that end users consider certain characteristics as inherent in works, and that the expressions that reflect those characteristics can be felt are to best represent the intention of the creators of that work, even though those characteristics are characteristics of attributes rather than the works. For many purposes, end users seek out expressions that display original characteristics. The values of expression attributes that reflect a canonical expression of a work can be notionally transferred to the work and used in work identification, although strictly speaking, these attributes concern expression characteristics and not work characteristics. So what would be an example of them? One of these would be language. For example, there are many different expressions of Homer's Ilias or Iliad. You can find examples in Greek, you can find Latin, and in various other languages, English, French, and so on. However, most people would feel that the original Greek is the canonical expression of the Iliad, and that as such, the work of the Iliad is in some ways bound up with Greek in a way that it is not bound up with other languages. Greek, the Greek language thus becomes the representative expression of the Iliad as a work. Similarly, one can come across, in terms of genre, one can come across poetry and poetic and prose versions of the Iliad. Here again, poetry is often considered to be closer to the intent of the original Iliad, and so again, poetry would be viewed as a representative expression attribute that somehow is closer to the notion of the work than the prose attribute would be, and so on. Another new attribute within LRM is the manifestation statement. A manifestation statement is a statement appearing in exemplars of the manifestation and deemed to be significant for users to understand how the resource represents itself. It consists of the imprint information as it appears on items exemplifying a manifestation. For example, the statement of the place of publication, publisher name, date of publication, and edition statement. Manifestation statement is included in LRM because the self-representation of a manifestation is an important means of identifying it and distinguishing it from other manifestations of the same work. Manifestation statement concerns the transcribed data in contradistinction to real-world data. With regards to the latter, place of publication, publisher, and the date of publication can be expressed as separate entities, place, collective agent, and time span, respectively, placed into relation with a manifestation by means of relationships. And finally, we end with the Nomen string, which is the combination of signs that forms an appellation associated with an entity through the nomen. As the LRM scope note indicates, the string involved in a nomen can be expressed as a notation in any form, such as a combination of signs within a writing system, chemical structure symbols, mathematical notation, or any other kind of sign, such as sounds. So here are examples of nomen strings. The string of characters that makes up the string Pocahontas, the string C2H60, the long string 978-0-8790-264-3, and then the long string making up that URL. Again, it's important to remember that the nomen string is not identical with the nomen, but becomes a component of a nomen only through the act of naming. Thus, the string Pocahontas becomes the name Pocahontas only when it's applied to either a particular person or the particular movie. C2H60 becomes a name only when it's applied to dimethyl ether. The third string, the 978, etc. string, becomes a an ISBN only when it's assigned by ISBN to an identifier. And finally, the URL, which is the URL actually to the LRM report, becomes a name only when it is only within the framework of the HTTPS naming system. So seeing that we are running short on time, we'll skip through relationships which you can look at when the slides are sent to you. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact me at tmdousa@uchicago.edu. I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tom, for a really great presentation. So yes, as you just said, we do now have time for questions. If you have not already done so, please go ahead and enter your questions into the question box. And while we're waiting for those to come in, I wonder, Tom, if you could maybe speak a little bit to whether or not this model has impacted your work at all, or perhaps the work of your colleagues that you're aware of.
It's begun to have an impact in RDA Toolkit in that some of the terminology, for example, the terminology of agent is now to be found in the current text of the toolkit. But other than that, there is still much that remains to be resolved. For example, it is unclear yet precisely how such concepts as a representative expression or manifestation statements are going to be implemented in RDA, much less how then they will be implemented in the data content standards that are in which RDA is going to be expressed, such as MARC or eventually BibFrame. So that there has been, I think, some seepage, shall we say, of LRM concepts into the into a cataloging practice, but it's the full dimensions of the change will become apparent only once the RDA toolkit and therefore RDA has been fully refounded according to the structure of LRM.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so we have a couple questions that have come in now. The first is, what is the relationship between LRM and the SciDoc CRM? Was SciDoc CRM considered as a source for some of the aspects of the LRM?
That's a good question, and it served, I think, as an inspiration, but it's actually now serving as the basis for what will be a new version of LRM, IFLA LRM 00. As you know, IFLA issued two different standards of FRBR. FRBR in general for the library world, but then also FRBR 00, which stands for Object-Oriented FRBR, which was a different version of FRBR, a different conceptual model that sought to align bibliographical conceptual modeling with the sort of conceptual modeling that you find in SciDoc CRM, which, as you know, was originally developed within the framework of the museum community. So even as IFLA LRM is in the process of being implemented within the cataloging community, the same group that developed IFLA LRM for IFLA is at work in developing a version of LRM that will seek to integrate it with SciDoc CRM.
Okay, thanks. Could you give an example of how day-to-day cataloging would be different under LRM from FRBR?
That's a good question. That will depend in large part how certain of these concepts are implemented eventually in the RDA Toolkit. Take, for example, the manifestation statement. This is a category that has the promise to make the biggest difference. Because right now, manifestation, the way that that manifestations statements are recorded in catalogs are primarily in the 300 field, and there they actually are sort of a hybrid form of manifestation statement. On the one hand, one is supposed to transcribe bits and pieces of what the manifestation says about its place of publication, its publisher, and its date of publication. On the other hand, it re-articulates them and places them in a different order than may be found on the piece in hand. So in this case, what's possible is that there might eventually be two different fields for entering information about publishers, places of publication, and dates. One of them would provide the manifestation statement transcribed exactly as it appears on the piece in hand. What you see is what you get. Whereas you might have separate fields that in which you have more formalized ways of recording the place of publication, publisher, and date. So I think that is one way in which there may be a difference in day-to-day cataloging caused by LRM. Whether this proves to be the case, however, remains to be seen.
Thanks, that was a really good example. Our next question is, can you please explain Nomen again? Is Nomen an abstract? Is Nomen abstract, or does it represent something that is concrete? And could you please give an example?
Again, that's a good question, and it really highlights the difficulty of of the conceptual difficulty of coming to terms with what a nomen is. The best way to think of it is that a nomen is an abstract entity in which concrete entities participate. So on the one hand, we have an entity, a res or an entity. Say we have the 17th century Indian woman who rescued John Smith. On the other hand, and so that is a concrete entity. On the other hand, we have the string P-O-C-A-H-O-N-T-A-S, which again is concrete when it's written down on a sheet of paper or typed into a search box. That is a nomen string. The nomen, in a sense, is the relationship between the string and the entity to which it refers. So that in virtue of being placed into relationship to the entity, to the person Pocahontas, the string Pocahontas becomes a name or forms part of the nomen entity as such. As you can see, this is not an easy concept at all to grasp. What is important to keep in mind is that the nomen string at all in itself is not identical to the nomen. The nomen incorporates the nomen string, but only in relation to the particular entity to which the nomen string is refers. I don't know if that clarifies things at all, but I hope that it at least provides some comfort in knowing that if you're having difficulties understanding what a nomen is, it's not you. It's the fact that it is a very difficult concept to articulate.
Thank you. All right, we have time for just one more question. So this is kind of a comment and question. It says, interesting how the expression has gone from being a rather vaguely defined entity in FRBR to a central entity in LRM. Do you have a sense yet of how that will affect RDA?
I think that where it might actually have the greatest impact will be in how RDA, on attempts to eventually express RDA in something like BibFrame. Because BibFrame operates according to a different conceptual model where you have only three bibliographic entities: work, instance, and item. And where the BibFrame work actually maps to work and expression in LRM. So LRM may, in really defining expression more stringently, is continuing a distinction already in FRBR that is then effaced in other bibliographic models that RDA will eventually have to make its peace with. And what's interesting in this case is that certain attributes, such as the representative expression attribute, can actually be viewed as a way of unifying works and expressions without simply merging them into a single entity.
Okay, thank you. So we do have a few remaining questions that were submitted. Our presenters kindly offered to answer those in writing, so those will be sent out to our attendees via email. We are so glad you could be with us today. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please do take a few minutes to respond to the questions. Your comments are very valuable and help the ELECTS Continuing Education Committee plan future events. The email will also include links to today's slides and recordings. You now have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance, and that information will also be in the email. So thank you again to our presenter, Tom Dousa, and thanks also to members of the Continuing Education Committee, Catherine Balick and Joseph Nicholson, and to Alana Warren from the ELECTS office. The support they provide make it possible for us to present these webinars. ELECTS has other continuing education events coming up. Please see the ELECTS website to register or find more information on this and other upcoming webinars. And finally, ELECTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. Our next e-forum will be on December 11th, discussing migrating technical services. Check the website for information on upcoming courses and discussions. Thank you all again for joining us today. This concludes our session.